Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to welcome two of our foremost skians of Fleet Street, as was, Geordie Greig and Lynn Barber, to the Charleston Festival. Geordie's a journalist and editor, having worked at the Sunday Times as its arts correspondent and literary editor. He subsequently became editor of the Tatler, the London Evening Standard, and currently the Mail on Sunday. His previous book, The Kingmaker, was the story of his grandfather's friendship with George VI. His current book, Breakfast with Lucian, contains a candid account of Lucian Freud's intimate revelations during the artist's breakfast salons at Clark's Restaurant in Kensington, where Geordie was a regular attendee, as well as interviews with members of Freud's close circle of friends, family, and former lovers. Lynn Barber's interviews have won 5 British Press Awards. She worked for Penthouse magazine for 7 years after leaving Oxford, then the Sunday Express, the Independent on Sunday, Vanity Fair, the Daily Telegraph, the Observer, and currently the Sunday Times. Her books include 2 collections of interviews, as well as the memoir of her teenage love affair with a conman, An Education, which was adapted by Nick Hornby into a film which launched the career of Carey Mulligan. Lynn's current book, A Curious Career, carries on where that book left off and is also a wonderful primer on interviewing techniques, illustrated by some choice examples, including Salvador Dali, Marianne Faithfull, a dying Christopher Hitchens, and Hilary Mantel. In the course of A Curious Career, Lynn Barber reveals that her favourite interview subjects are artists. They've included David Hockney, Gilbert and George, Sarah Lucas and Tracy Emin, the latter of whom have both become friends. So this is an opportunity for Lynn Barber to interview Geordie Greig about interviewing Lucian Freud. Does she think that he did his subject justice? Would she have left anything out? Would she have got more out of him? Let's discover what happens when Lynn Barber gets into her stride.
Of course, I'm sick with envy because I spent years and years and years trying to get an interview with Lucian Freud, and it was almost worth doing because I got this wonderfully rude letter from him saying I prefer not to be shat on by a stranger, which is framed in my loo. But he never would give me an interview, whereas Geordie seems to have just waltzed in and been asked to breakfast, and I wonder if it's a mark of Lucian Freud's snobbishness that you have a social background and I don't.
I always thought you did have a social background.
No, I don't.
Do you know, the reason Lucian saw me, because I stalked him for 20 years.
Well, so did I. But
not long enough. I wrote age 17
yes.
to him. And I was taken up to. I was at school at Eton, and a master took us up to London. And I saw this small exhibition of his paintings, 17 pictures in one room. And, it kind of blew my mind. It was the height of the punk era. I thought this was more subversive, more interesting, more dangerous, more unanswered questions than anything I'd ever come across. So I wrote to him. No reply. Yeah. And that went on for 20 years.
Yes.
Until I got a similar letter from you. Sorry, from him.
Saying I'd hate to take yes.
Yeah. I still wait for my letter from Lynn. Yeah. Saying, dear Mr. Greig, the idea of giving you an interview, this was for a retrospective of the Tate, makes me sick.
Yes.
But let's reconsider by the time the exhibition comes round. And that was, I think, one of only 2 letters I ever got from Lucian.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But you were when he succumbed, and what was it, the Frank Auerbach?
Well, I tricked him.
And you were editor of Tatler by then.
I was editor of Tatler, and I wrote constantly, and I used to go and write to other artists, and in order to try and get close to him, and I wrote to Francis Bacon, who I did see. I wrote to David Hockney, who I did see. But Lucian always somehow never answered. But I knew he got his letters because there were other people around who sort of, in the small circle of his life, did realise that these letters had arrived, and he didn't mind them. I think he was quite flattered, as all people are, to get anyone stalking them, as long as they're not going to try and murder them. And eventually, I got to him by luck, really, because I was literary editor of the Sunday Times, and I sent him a book of. I thought I was incredibly clever. I thought Stanley Spencer, Freud, of course, this is the way forward. He's going to absolutely write a wonderful piece about how his paintings are all based on Stanley Spencer. So I sent off this, another sycophantic letter, and suddenly my deputy literary editor says to me, I got Lucian Freud on the phone. And I said, yeah, and I'm Michael Jackson. And she said, no, I think it really, really, really is. And I said, well, I'm quite busy, but, I'm really cross if it's not. And down the phone came this blast of 1940s Berlin, this hint of a whole culture and background which had evaporated. There was a sort of sound of Stephen Spender, Cyril Connolly.
But there was also a slight speech impediment, wasn't there?
Well, it's called a German accent, Lynn, actually.
Oh, is it? Okay, yeah.
Nigel Farage, where are you? We need you. There was a lisp of Germanic left over.
Wasn't there?
Well, it was called Lucian.
Yes.
And it was, Neil McGregor, the director of the National Gallery, as he was at one stage, said it was very much an acquired accent from those sort of cultural grandees after he came in to England in 38 and was sort of pounced on in the latter years by these people as this sort of wunderkind who was, lithe, sexy, wild, clearly with an air of genius. But he was. So this phone call came, and I then said, I'm going to send you this book about Stanley Spencer. And he said, I just hope you don't think that my paintings have anything to do with Stanley Spencer. So I immediately said, of course not. How could anyone think that? But I thought it would be interesting for you to say that. And so I sent him the book, and of course he then rang a few days later and said, he wouldn't review the book. So I thought, another months and years of pause go by. And then I write him again. It's really my last shot. And I say, I've got a brilliant idea in a postcard, but I've got to see you in person. So he calls again and says, hi, it's Lucian. And do you want to meet for breakfast at 6:45 at the studio? So I go, yes, I do. So he puts the phone down. Luckily, I knew where the studio was. He never, ever said goodbye, ever. The conversation just ended. So at 6:45, I turn up at the studio, and in Holland Park, and ring top floor bell, go up about 4 flights. Bizarrely, my brother was living in the same building. We were not, as a family, stalking him. It just was a coincidence. And there, silhouetted, was this sort of Beckett-like figure, raggedy, trousers of a kind of like a traditional butcher's trousers, checked, blue and white, and this linen shirt, slightly rumpled, and these eyes which just looked with a sort of ferocity at this, like an eagle, and I was this mouse, about to be kind of gulped up. And, he was, just intense vision and powers of observation. In I go. And we sit down, and he said, would you like some breakfast? And I said, well, that'd be very nice. And so he gives me, for breakfast, some partridge wings and some burgundy.
Yeah.
Normal Notting Hill breakfast, of course. And we have, we get chatting, and then he sort of pauses, and I think, oh, God, my idea, so bad. Anyway, I give it a go, and I say, look, you won't be interviewed, will you? And he says, no. Yeah, and you won't be photographed, will you? He says, no. I said, okay, here's my idea. It's a really, really good idea. I want to photograph Frank Auerbach, fellow German emigre artist, who used to breakfast with Lucian every week for about 40 years. And you, Lucian, can be in the photograph too.
That's good.
And he goes, okay. So he then says, we'll meet for breakfast, 6:45, at the Cock Tavern in the Meatpacking District in London. And then we then meet there, and we take this amazing picture of them both having a cup of tea, and we have kidneys and bacon and more traditional breakfast. And then he drives me back afterwards to Notting Hill. And the conversation never stops. From dancing with Greta Garbo, having a row with Ian Fleming. I didn't sleep with his wife. Fine. And the wheels barely touch the ground as we cascade through red lights at every possible turn. And I'm completely hooked, because most people, famous people, I'm sure you would agree,
Yes, what?
don't live up to the expectation of you want to continue seeing them on a regular basis.
Yeah,
And I was just thought, forget breakfast. How about lunch, dinner, tea?
Yes.
I mean, he was just completely electrifying and intoxicating and charismatic, and he just didn't know how to do dull. It was.
But one thing that struck me in your book is you asked him to do a photograph with Frank Auerbach.
Yeah.
At that point, you hadn't mentioned this idea to Frank Auerbach.
No, you're right.
It could have gone badly wrong.
It really could. I quickly,
and I suspect it's that sort of thing, which is why he's an editor. They have to have that sort of chutzpah, I think.
Chutzpah.
Chutzpah.
No, there was an element of, also the terrible thing with Frank, he doesn't ever give the telephone number like Lucian to anyone.
Yeah.
So I had to write to Frank saying, "Dear Frank, I got this brilliant idea." And luckily he was, because I'd interviewed Frank when I was at university, and he'd been incredibly nice.
So you had some background.
Well, I
with
hoped
him.
that it was,
Yeah.
luckily it did work.
And then Lucian started inviting you fairly regularly to breakfast in Clark's restaurant.
Yes, I mean, he did. I mean, I never had his telephone number because he never gave it to anyone. His children, most of his children didn't have it. Some did. Some of his models did. Some didn't. I mean, he was incredibly private. So I would just wait for the call, and sometimes the call would come at 2 a.m. And I'd sometimes be abroad, and I remember on election night he called at 2 a.m. He just said, I thought you'd know what was going on. Can you tell me what's going on? And I was still up, and it was, so we talked for about an hour and a half, and then about the election and Blair and what was going on, and him remembering Attlee and sort of quarrels with Churchill. I mean, it was always somehow. He was sort of like the intellectual Forrest Gump. The whole century seemed to have touched him.
Yes.
You suddenly said Graham Greene. Oh yeah, what a shit! I remember he was. And you could almost kind of play. It was like having a whole keyboard in front of you. You said, "Let me try the F
Just
minor
for a name.
sharp."
Yeah.
George Orwell. Bing. Yes. He'd slept with his wife. I mean, it was just incredible.
Yeah. And how did you record? I mean, did you go away and write notes, or did you? You didn't actually have a tape recorder.
No, I did have a tape recorder. I mean, towards the end, I used to just plonk that on the table, and because I did a couple of interviews with him for Tatler magazine, and he rather loved Tatler. He sort of liked the idea that it was the most unlikely place he'd be.
Oh, I mean, he was such a social butterfly, wasn't he? I mean, it's not the most unlikely place he'd be. Much more unlikely to find.
If that's what he thought, I was very happy for him to think
Yes.
that he brought him in. And he was. And Lucian loved to be in control. So when he did, because he only wrote 2 articles in his life. One was in 1954 for Stephen Spender for Encounter, Some Thoughts on Painting, and then 50 years later, I asked him if he'd do another one for me. For Tatler. I said, why don't you do some more thoughts on painting? And he said, he'd think about it. And then he wrote this amazing article, all of 75 words. And he remembered that the one thing he'd left out in his original article was the word and he capitalised it. Paint! And that was what he wanted to remember, really, and that was the central core of his life. And that, you know, that was really the sort of mattress of his life. Everything laid on top of that: lovers, children, friends, the work. And the work was the central core, even though there's a lot of children, lovers, sex in this book.
Yes,
Also,
we'll come on to that,
okay,
don't worry. I won't miss it out.
I thought you might.
But did you ever try and steer the conversation? I mean, did you ever think, I'm going to have lunch with and breakfast with Lucian, I must try and open him up about Lady Caroline Blackwood or something? I mean, did you think like that?
Caroline Blackwood, who was his second wife, I knew very, very well, because my girlfriend before I got married was her daughter. I know it sounds as if I was stalking him in a bizarre way. It was a pure coincidence. So we used to absolutely love talking about Caroline, who was amazing. I mean, she married the three muses. She married paint, Lucian, poetry, Robert Lowell, and music, the composer, Secretive. And she was wild and unpredictable, and you know, she was this muse. And of course, he cast their very short marriage within two pictures, where you have one where she's wide-eyed and beautiful and between the sheets, looking inviting and happy, and the other where she's between the sheets, looking terrified and harassed, and a victim as he's hovering over her. So I mean,
and do you think he knew that you'd gone out with, what was it,
Ivana? No, he absolutely did. He completely did, because you know, I mean, Lucian was completely full of vituperative, sort of passionate outbursts against people, and part of the family he loathed, and he would always say so. And I'd always say, "God, you know, Lucian, why don't you jump off the fence and say what you really think?" And he had a tremendous sense of humour. So I felt I could ask him absolutely anything.
Do you think he had any sense that you might be heading for a book? And did he or David Dawson, who was his great assistant, did either of them say you ought to talk to so-and-so or sort of steer you to somebody?
No, because when I was on the Sunday Times as a reporter in the late 80s, and I remember a freelance journalist calling me up and saying he was thinking of doing a profile, just a mere profile on Lucian, and some East End heavies had come round, sent by Lucian, to suggest it not the best idea. Profile didn't make it. And another author did do a book on Lucian, which Lucian cooperated with, but Lucian then paid him a six-figure sum in order for the book not to be published.
Oh, who was that?
That was Bill Fever.
Oh, it is, but Bill Fever is still
He's now doing it, yeah.
Okay, and since he won't mention this, there is actually another very good book called Man in a Blue Scarf.
Oh, yeah, which is very, very good, yes.
About
very, very good
posing book for Lucian Freud.
Yeah, it's a very, very good book indeed.
George is good on the sort of social thing, but on the technique, he's better. By Martin Gayford. Sorry.
We were getting on so well. I tell you what David Dawson said about the comparison between the two books.
Yeah.
And I do think Martin Gibbs has done a really, really good book, and I would highly recommend it. I really would. He says, the book has no sex.
Therefore, it's not accurate, yes.
And Lucian's life and work was majorly driven by sex.
Yeah.
You know, 14 acknowledged children, probably another 20 unacknowledged children, lovers, 400, 500, wives, 2, lovers,
Yeah.
I mean, women at the same time.
3 babies by 3.
3 children, all born in 61 by 3 different women. he wasn't.
Yes, he was
didn't hold
spreading it
back.
about. But
Yeah.
actually, I was very intrigued. You have a couple of the women, and I can't remember who, saying that he was a bit sadistic, or he could be sadistic in bed, hurting their nipples and things.
He. This is recorded by. I mean, it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And the variety of views of what Lucian was like as a lover, a father, a friend, is, I suppose, in many ways, like all of ours, varied. But his was particularly varied in that his life was so extraordinarily segmented and partitioned. And I remember talking to Annie, his oldest daughter, who's now in her mid to late 60s, and she was painted age 14 naked in a picture called Naked Girl Laughing, and much to the fury of her mother, who thought this was unethical. She was Jacob Epstein's daughter, so Epstein had pushed the barriers, as I'm sure all of you will know, with painting in a social and artistic way, to be in a sort of early provocateur in some ways. And so Lucian laughed at this letter of objection. But he, it was quite disturbing for Annie. And she recounts to me how, with a paintbrush, he would lean forward and just move the strands of her hair to make her nipples visible. Quite odd for a father and a daughter. I have a 14-year-old daughter at the moment, two 14-year-old daughters at the moment. Not by different women, twins. So it was quite.
Yeah.
He was not. There was an edginess, and also Annie remembers going to dinner with Lucian, and there were two people opposite them with him, and they introduced themselves. Annie was aged 24, and they were in their teens, two brothers and sisters, and she went, oh. She had no idea she had any other brethren, or
any siblings,
any other siblings apart from her sister. So it was an amazing life with questionable threads of morality and questionable threads of behaviour, but actually he was within that. There was a terrific honesty in that what he did, and he made no bones of it.
Yes,
really,
and he certainly didn't promise these women that he was going to marry them and sort of give them.
No, I mean he tried marriage twice and realised that wasn't possibly the best structure for his life.
Who eluded you? Who would you have liked to have got interviews with and you didn't? I mean, it's not much from Susanna Chancellor.
No, I did speak to Susanna actually. I mean, there was almost. I don't think there was anyone I can think of.
Who you couldn't get?
I mean, Jane Willoughby, who was a great love of his life, I sat next to at dinner, and she was amazing talking about him. And then I wrote to her the next day, and she said she didn't want to participate in the book. And I thought, well, but you already have. To some extent, because not that I quoted her, but there were things she said which were incredibly interesting about him, because she was, there were two or three women who were, even though he had this incapacity for fidelity, he was a very faithful friend, and he did stay in touch with Jane, Susanna,
sorry.
For about 50 years, and they were in and out of his life.
Yes.
So there was something incredibly moving about his friendship,
Is there a theory that women he didn't paint naked meant more to him than women he did paint naked? That the great loves were never naked?
Well, Susanna wasn't naked,
wasn't.
and Jane, I don't know if Jane was or wasn't. People always say there were naked pictures in one of her amazing houses, but I mean, maybe there aren't.
Right.
But I mean, Lucian used to say that a lot of women with a hole in their heart found being painted partly fills that hole. So in other words, there was an element of him acknowledging
it's surrender,
damage.
isn't it?
Yeah.
and passivity, obviously.
Yeah.
In that you have to.
But he was full of smart little aphorisms. Like he said, I remember him saying the death of a friendship is much sadder than the death of a friend.
Yes,
isn't it?
yes, yeah. But I thought he went around picking fights and
Oh, he
killing
did.
friendships.
No, but he did pick fight. I mean, in his 80s, you know, I remember going to breakfast one morning and he looked looking a bit dishevelled. And he'd had a fight in the supermarket with someone.
It would have been very embarrassing if they'd flattened our greatest living painter or sort of
I know.
killed him in the supermarket. David Hockney maintained that David Dawson, the assistant who lived with him for the last years of his life, that he, was his great love, or at any rate that Lucian painted him with more love than any of the women he was supposed to love.
I think that says, I mean, I do say that in the book, and I quote David saying that. I think that says a lot about Lucian and David. I mean, it was a platonic affair. David is openly gay, and is he's a year older than me. So there's a good 30-year gap plus with Lucian. I mean, they never lived together. He was an assistant for a gallery, and then Lucian sort of brought him in, and he was like a very, very gentle protector. And by gentle, I mean he had incredibly complicated cast to deal with. The children, the lovers, the past lovers. And so he did this with great generosity of spirit and a kind of selflessness. Often gatekeepers to famous people sort of think they are important. And of course they are, because they've got the key. Yeah. They're not important because they're not the real thing. I think Lucian really did love David. And you know, every single day for the last 3 years of his life, almost every single day, really almost every single day, David would sit naked in front of him while this last picture, called Portrait of a Hound, was painted. And it's David sitting naked and a whippet next door to them. And it is bathed in a very soft, glowing, gentle
fond
light.
Sort of light.
Yeah, it's great. It's moving, but it's moving for a number of reasons. It's moving because it's the final work, which was never completed. Lucian knew if he completed it, that was the end of probably him, because he wouldn't have the strength, aged 88 plus, to begin a major new work. It was moving because it was a connection with a basic man, you know, seeing this naked figure every day, which is what Lucian was about for so long. And it was moving because there was sometimes Lucian might just do a very few strokes, not feeling very well. But there was that connection of intimacy, there was a connection of paint, as he would shout, capitalising it. And I think David, you know, very, very astute observer.
Yeah. And a kind
person.
Yeah.
Saw that. And I think it was the final. There were two of them pictures of David. They were the final two pictures in the. I'm sure many of you went to the National Portrait Gallery show, which was the most brilliant show. And hail to the National Portrait Gallery for doing it. It really was extraordinary. It was the most popular portrait show I think they'd had of a single artist. So it was a complete triumph the way they did it, and it was, you went through these rather raw, naked portraits in that middle section, and then came on to this soft, rather an edge of sentimentality, which was unusual for him.
Yes. Did Lucian ever get irritated by you? Were there any sort of fodder where you didn't hear anything for a long time? Sorry.
We never had a cross word, which I think was. I mean, we didn't see each other on a daily basis, so there wasn't. And also, I was when I knew him, I was editing Tatler and then the Evening Standard. So I was always quite a good source for quite interesting things going on, and he was dead curious about what was going on.
Yeah. Was he keen on gossip, actually? I
He
mean,
loved gossip.
yeah. I mean, like, if I know he died by then, but if the sort of Nigella Saatchi disintegrated, that was the sort of thing
we
he
would
loved
love
to-
that. We'd have a view on Saatchi.
Yes,
You know,
yes. So do you think that was your value to him, or did he love you for your Bergier, or what?
What do you think?
I'm not sure.
We were getting on so well. We just clicked, actually.
Yeah.
And, I was of a, when I was a precocious schoolboy, I used to write to John Piper and Graham Sutherland and Henry Moore and go and interview them very early on. And so, I was riveted rather ridiculously by all that.
Yeah.
And of course he knew them and would say, God, isn't Graham a crap painter? And I go, God, well, people can be disrespectful of Mr. Sutherland. And so it was fascinating. I was just, completely riveted. And
Are you actually writing these sucking up letters to people sort of every week? I mean, are you? Is that what you
I'm
do?
waiting for your answer. Yeah.
I mean, have you got a lot of people in your sites like that?
Well, if your sadness was you didn't interview Lucian, my sadness was I didn't interview J.D. Salinger.
Oh yes, nobody.
Who was impossible.
Nobody did, though, did
No,
they?
no.
But did you try very hard? I mean,
No, not nearly hard enough. The truth is, if you try very hard, with Francis Bacon, I wrote to his gallery, and then I can remember going down to the call box when I was at university and, putting my 10p or 2 shillings, whatever it was then, in and talking to the gallery every single week for 6 months.
Oh, God.
Until Miss Beston, who then ran his life, suddenly said, I've spoken to him, Francis, and he'll see you.
Oh, great.
And then,
good. So that was effort rewarded. I mean,
I sort of have a view of life. If you really want something, you've got a jolly good chance if you really, really, really try try again.
But my Lucian Freud experience disproved that, because not only did I write him every week for weeks, for years.
You weren't cunning enough.
But also,
you weren't cunning enough.
Yes, I probably didn't ladle the flattery on, but also...
We were getting on so well.
But also, I did enlist, there were quite a lot of people like Bruce Bernard, people
Yeah.
who were real friends of his, who were on my side.
But you listen, you are the most incredible interviewer. And your interview with Gilbert and George, which I remember, because it was, you sort of ambushed them with the fact that, George had been married.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, that is what an interview's about. You're full of surprises, you hold no hostages, you are only interested in making it addictively exciting in terms of finding information and bringing it out in a way which is, like a razor-sharp conversation. And I suspect you would have scared him because you would have trapped him. I don't mean trapped in a way which was deceitful in a way, but he would have felt this is too much of a set piece. And all my interviews with him were built up over conversations over weeks.
Yes.
And suddenly, you and I know that sense. Normally you've got 45 minutes or an hour to interview someone, and we were discussing earlier how, you were saying, yes, you want to talk about that, go on, yes, but I really want you to talk about something which is really revelatory. And the interview is partly about stealing information, and it probably is stealing.
Yes.
Which hopefully turns into a gift.
Yes. But, a lot of modern, contemporary interviewing with actors and things, it is this rather sort of squalid trade-off that they are trying to publicise their film or their book or whatever, and will graciously consent to see you for, in my case, I say it has to be a minimum of an hour, but some people are expected to write a great big cover story on the basis of having met somebody for about 5 minutes, or maybe not even met them, maybe just talked on the phone. But with Lucian Freud, it wouldn't be like that. It would be more that he liked you and wouldn't have. I can see he wouldn't have liked me.
As you and I know, the Hollywood thing is,
horrible.
Well, there's the interview which you and I would hope to do, or there's the junket.
Yes.
And the junket is where they get 5 journalists round a table. And normally it's one Japanese, one German, one Finn, and then there's Sandra Bullock. And the Japanese will go, "Do you wear bikini when you swim?" Yeah. And then the Swede will go, can we discuss the philosophical nature of this trashy comedy which you're in? So it's absolutely hopeless. And you and I would find that frustrating.
Well, I just refuse to do it, actually. I think you have to put your foot down.
Robert Hart on that.
You just to pick up something, you said he had 14 official children.
Yeah.
If you, I mean, can you, I'm not asking you to actually name them, but I mean, could you say, well, I know of 20, as it were?
I don't know if I could go as far as 20. I could go up to high single figures.
Well, you're supposed to have 14, so you ought to go.
No, of the acknowledged one, I can name all the ones who are acknowledged.
Okay,
Absolutely,
yes.
Easy.
Yes, but then you could add another.
I could add another 8 or 9.
Okay.
And then other people will come up to me and say, 30.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. But some of them, because he did have a sort of penchant for posh women.
Yeah.
Some of them are, or would be, if they were disclosed, no longer the heirs to great houses and great titles.
So somebody might
Let's set that hair running. Yeah.
So somebody could be the Earl of somewhere while actually being...
I'm sorry, your time is up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you own any works by Lucian Freud?
I got a couple of letters, which I told you about,
Yeah.
and I got an etching or 2.
Oh, that he gave you? Or... most people would think that editing a newspaper was a full-time job, and yet you've managed to write this really very good book. And have you got another book up your sleeve?
I have. It did almost kill me because I wrote all of it when I was editor of the Evening Standard.
Gosh.
And my day for the Standard began at 4:30 in the morning. It's not really the morning, it's the middle of the night. So I had to get up at 4:30 in order to be in the paper by... Actually, I had a very odd routine. I used to go, rather pathetically, my alarm used to go at 4:29. And then I'd jump in a bath. And then I know I was going to feel so ill from tiredness the rest of the day, I would go back to bed for 6 minutes. And I was able to fall asleep for 6 minutes.
Gosh.
And then I'd go, oh, and go to work. And during the period when I was really heavily writing the book, which I wrote the whole of this book on a BlackBerry.
That's impossible, because it's so sort of...
No, but I tell you what's great, if you're in bed,
Yes, you can...
it doesn't wake anyone.
Oh, I see. Yes,
I
yes.
mean, by anyone, I mean my wife.
Yes. Yes.
And so and I would then send it to me as an email. And you can do about 2,400 words on a BlackBerry. And then in the morning, I used to write sometimes between about 2 and 3:30, and I'd go to sleep again.
Gosh.
So it was a regime of hell. And then the weekends, I could write at the weekends. Except my children would say, "What's Daddy doing?" "He's doing the book." "Which book?" "That damn book." Because it would take time away from them. But it was, I used to bank sleep and try and find time. And then I would go to the office in the weekend where it was completely quiet.
Oh, God.
And then I would rewrite the rubbish I'd written at 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Because I'm a great rewriter. I suspect
Right.
you're very fluent and you do it first. No?
No.
No? Okay. Just trying to ask a small question.
You also also, actually, another bonus in this book is some lovely photographs by you, and I was annoyed by that too. I thought, he not only edits newspapers, gets to meet artists, he can also take photos, and they are good.
Well,
actually.
thank you. No, I'm really enjoying this now. I was listen, the access I had to Lucian was amazing. And when we were sitting at breakfast, because we are all paparazzi. We all have mobile phones. You're all able to take pictures. I might even take your picture, Lynn, now.
No.
And I could, And so I was able to take some pictures of us or him at breakfast. But the greatest moment photographically, and actually a moment of intimacy, was I took a long time to build up to ask Lucian, could I be in the room, in the studio in Notting Hill when he was painting David naked? And they kept saying no. And I kept sort of not really asking, but sort of hanging around. And eventually David said, I think it's going to be fine, you can just come up. So I came up and sort of sat in a corner, and David just took his clothes off and Lucian got his paintbrush. And I just thought, wow, this is amazing. That real relaxed, quiet, intimate time between them. This is how it actually happens. Really, really special time.
As a journalist, with a newspaper, surely sometimes he must have told you something that you thought, oh, that would make a diary piece, or that would make, that you could spill some gossip. And did you ever do that?
I never did. No. Frankly, I'm quite good. The problem is, if Lynn and I are at a dinner party, and someone comes out with some fabulous story, and everyone goes, of course, this is very, very private, and we all go, absolutely very private, we will shut up, on the whole. I will.
Yeah.
You will?
Well, go on. What are you going to say? I must say... Yeah. Go on. Okay. No, finish your thought, and then I'll say mine.
Okay. And if the story then gets out, everyone will blame either Lynn or me, because they all think we're the only people who have the morals of a low snake who will do it.
And
actually, I think we don't.
No, exactly. But,
not a low one, anyway.
No. Well, except you did say earlier just now that sometimes you'll find yourself sat next to someone at a dinner party and chat to them about Lucian Freud. Or you did. And for me, that would be sort of quite
dodgy.
Quite dodgy. But because I make a great thing of sort of, here is my tape recorder, and now I am interviewing you, as opposed to chatting, But also, I wouldn't trust myself to remember a word that anyone said at a dinner party.
I think on the whole, I think that's correct. I think a dinner party is private. When I was put next to Jane, I'd been specially put there by the hostess, who knew that I wanted to talk to her about Lucian. And I think there's a difference between a book and a newspaper. I think there's a difference between writing for the immediacy of a newspaper and, without sounding too pompous, the sort of a history book.
Yeah.
If I can call mine a history book of some record.
Yeah.
But listen, we all get into these terrible difficulties of
yes,
I'm quite good at, my rule generally is I've always try and think and with the Mail on Sunday, of course, it's a wider, larger, and sometimes more acid tactic. But I argue to myself, as long as I've done everything which I can feel comfortable sitting opposite the person I've written about, and they may say, I wish you hadn't done that, or I hate you for doing that, or it's wrong. And if it's wrong factually, I will feel aghast, because it's my job to make sure it's accurate. But if it's true, and we've been fair, and it's been without malice, I do think that in the end, all of us deserve to have newspapers which are able to deal with truths which sometimes are very difficult for people to face in politics, in personal lives.
Yes.
As long as it's not, of course, then we can go into the whole, intrusion and privacy. And privacy was what Lucian was all about. He valued his privacy more than anything. But
Yes.
never was a man's private life so publicly displayed
Yes.
in his art. So we have this contradiction. So that gave me a license, I think, to be able to ask him anything, and I could. But also, I think there was only one fact, which I'm not going to tell you, which I didn't put in the book, because it would have so overtoppled the book.
Oh. Well, the one fact I kept waiting to see if you tackled was whether he had an affair with the Duchess of Devonshire.
I said he did. Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
You did?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think our lawyers have put it in a
Okay.
less delicate. But I think there's no question he did.
Okay. Oh, so what's the fact? Oh, go on.
Is that how you get all the boys to talk?
But, yes, and did you, after the book came out, were there people writing to you or approaching you, sort of wanting to add material or change? I wondered if there were some new people who sort of rather resented that they weren't in the book, would want to talk to you.
I got to a point where I thought because I began the book really after he died, and I thought, right, I need to interview all the women in his life. But actually, I sort of built into, there were categories of those who mattered to him and those who mattered less, actually.
Yeah.
And the last few years, there was a black solicitor from Brighton, and there was a French girl, and there were lots of other characters, but they weren't important to his inner life.
Right.
So when I interviewed some of them, their tales were remarkably similar, but when I interviewed those who'd, had proper relationships, which was about passion and screaming matches and travelling together and all the sort of things which we do with people we're really involved with, the level of intimacy and knowledge was fantastic. So there were some people who I saw after the book who said, "Oh, I wish I'd spoken to you," and very few did I feel. There were a few though. I mean, Francis Wyndham I'd have liked to have spoken to, who was the novelist and writer and friend of Lucian's. And Frank Auerbach, funnily enough, I had spoken to him about Lucian, but when I was writing the book, he sort of put me, because we do see each other occasionally, he slightly put me in purdah, and he explained why, because he didn't really want, as he said, he's old, there's limited time, he's passionate about his work, and he didn't really want to spend an awful lot of time talking about Lucian. And so now the book's gone to bed, we've gone back to seeing each other.
Could you write, well, if it goes into paperback, I imagine you might add to it, but also you could usefully just keep a file of notes and odds and ends that, if somebody is writing a major biography of Lucian Freud in 100 years' time, they could also see. Yeah,
I mean, the extraordinary thing today is because everything's digital, all my interviews are on my computer, all my photographs are on my computer.
Yeah.
And there are things, obviously, there are things which I may have not thought interesting. I think I've plucked the main jewels from the crown of those interviews.
But I sometimes get this mad, it's absolutely maddening, where I've interviewed somebody and not quite been able to make up my mind, and then I will get a letter from somebody saying, I worked for her for 3 years, she is a total and utter bitch, she did X, Y, Z,
really? No, I never,
and I think, damn, I wish I could include that.
No.
Shall we open it up?
Yes, good idea.
Oh, there's a man over there.
Yes.
You've stressed the extent to which you found him charismatic and stimulating and his conversation riveting. Did you like him? I enjoyed your book very much, and I decided I didn't like him. Frankly, his comment about Graham Greene, I would apply to him. I thought he was a shit.
I did like him. I mean, he was an incredibly generous friend to me. He gave me time, he gave me consideration. We laughed a lot. He was, I mean, I've been very lucky but through my work, I've been able to see and get access and pursue people. And I would put him alongside two other people who I've found, three other people who I absolutely think were uniquely interesting beyond any expectation. Francis Bacon, Samuel Beckett, and Ted Hughes. And all of them had something animalistically self-preserving and selfish about them. But when their focus was on you, as the cliche goes, you felt you were the centre of a world. And he was kind, considerate, and wonderful to me, and wonderful to my children. As we all know, if people are wonderful to your children, you go weak at the knees and think they must be nice. And he was incredibly nice to my children. My son Jasper, who was then about 11 or and Lucian was an OM, Order of Merit, and Jasper said to me, "Oh, what is it? What is OM? Is it old man?" And Lucian laughed and laughed and laughed, and then Jasper once said to him, "You've got rather nice knees, haven't you?" Because he used to wear a little apron, and he just that he sort of his face crinkled into a smile, and he was there was a very enchanting, soft, engaging, lovely man there as well. But he did behave in I think listen, I knew him in his old age, and he sometimes did behave quite severely in a different direction. Right at the back.
I'm a fancy. How did he get all these women into bed? What was his seduction? Because he's not that amazing.
This may be like jazz. If you have to ask, you're never going to know. He was absolutely intent on that purpose. I can remember being, when I was at university, I remember the prettiest girl in my year was in a pub, and a man went up to her, gave her a bit of paper, and on it was his telephone number. And I said to her, "God, does that often happen?" And she said, "More often than you think." And of course, the more often than you think is true. And occasionally that will work. With Lucian, if he saw someone and he would go, "She's interesting, isn't she?" And he would, he made no bones about it. He would pursue, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. And he was incredibly charismatic. He was lithe, young, for his age always.
And there's wonderful, that gaze, wasn't there?
You met him.
Yeah, I did. Towards the end of his life. I just used to see him at parties, and by the absolute end of his life, I'd got a hello out of him. But that was my greatest achievement, I'm afraid. Charles.
Great. Yes.
Oh.
Geordie?
Yes. Go on.
I just wanted to ask, did you or Lucian Freud make any rules about whether the conversations at breakfast could be used either in his lifetime or afterwards, or was it assumed that they were private conversations?
I think neither of us like rules.
Right.
Yes. Sorry.
A lot of sex, and all those children. I'm thinking, Lynn particularly, is the same thing occurring to you? How many women really wanted some Freud in their gene pool?
Well, exactly. He wasn't interested in contraception, but obviously the women weren't either, and that might have been a reason for sleeping with him. I think that was also true of Ted Hughes, was it? I mean, lots of men seem to operate on that basis, and quite a lot of women seem prepared to.
But I think, also, I think there were some men who just have it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they just are unbelievably attractive, and you know, I remember going on talking to Ted Hughes, and he talked about how he liked train journeys. I say, oh, is that the kind of possibility that anything can happen? And he said yes.
Yeah.
And I think we all knew what he meant.
Yes.
So it's called, yes, and then this lady here.
Can I just ask, did he touch on his antipathy to John
Excuse me,
Crack?
can we have the mic there, please?
Yeah. Oh, you could repeat the question.
Did he ever talk about his antipathy with John Craxton that seemed to have parted them, having had this sort of great friendship in their early youth? And,
He did. I mean, John Craxton, contemporary of him, painter, they shared a flat in St John's Wood. They travelled to Greece together in the 40s and fell out majorly. He thought he was thought he'd stolen his work, copied him. I mean, there was almost this was one of the kind of vituperative hatreds he had. Absolutely thought he'd been shafted by him. Probably hadn't. But, you know, they'd fallen out. And Lucian, when he was very black and white. I think it's what artists do. It's what Caroline Blackwood used to do. She used to take a detail of someone and she'd go on and on and on. You know, it would be, God, Lynn in this green shirt. He was green. And it was such a kind of vivid green. You know, and that's
Scary.
what I think Lucian used to do with his art, that focus of a detail. And I think that used to happen with his likes and dislikes of people. So with Craxton, he absolutely, to his dying day, had no time for him at all.
There's a lady who's
Yes.
been trying for a long time.
I do apologise for moving off sex for a moment. I hope people will forgive me about that. I heard the man in the blue scarf talk
Yep.
about it. And what I felt was that Lucian Freud conducted a kind of therapy session, because he always said, I don't know how long it's going to take, and we're just going to sit here together. And I wondered if he ever talked to you about what it meant for him to be with somebody for such a long time, and whether they had conversations.
Well, he always did have amazing conversations, but what it was all about was the observation. I'm trying to see if I can draw it here, but maybe I haven't. Here we are. 1954, Lucian, Some Thoughts on Painting. And I think this may answer you. My object in painting is to try to move the senses by giving an intensification of reality. Whether this can be achieved depends on how intensely the painter understands and feels for the person or object of his desire. The subject must be kept under closest observation. If this is done day and night, the subject, he, she, or it, will eventually reveal the all, without which selection itself is not possible. They will reveal it through some and every facet of their lives or lack of life, through movement and attitudes, through every variation from one moment to another. And I think it was the intense process of trying to capture. One of the first pictures which I saw was called Man with Rat. This man called Raymond Jones, naked with a rat across his upper thigh, the tail towards his genitals. And I tracked down Raymond Jones, and the only reason the rat stayed there was they used to feed the rat a saucer of champagne and sleeping pills. And even when he was painting Raymond's toes or the sofa, Lucian insisted on him remaining naked in order to not change the atmosphere, and the rat had to be there too. So it was a big observation process which had to soak up what he saw, what he felt, what was there, to create it.
Very simple. Can I just say, there's a question in the corner there, perhaps we can get Have the microphone waiting there, okay? Melissa, you carry on. Okay.
Just interested to find out, what was the distance between Lucian and David when he was painting him?
3 foot, 4 foot, very close. I mean, the studio is not very big in Notting Hill. I mean, 5 foot maximum. Very close. And Lucian very close to the big painting. I don't know if it comes up. No. This is Caroline Blackwood at the end of their marriage. Devastated. That's Lorna Wishart, the first love of his life. That's Kitty, his Epstein, his first wife. That's Celia Paul, who had a child. He had a child by, and just a guy. That's Giacchetta, who had a child by him, and his mother. They never posed together in the same room. That's Jane Willoughby, great 50 years in his life, great patron of him. That is Alexis and him, model in the last 2 years. Various children, grandchildren, and Celia Paul. Lee Bowery and his wife. Felicity, who was a very early lover, well, quasi-lover. David, in the Portrait of a Hand. Lucian, taken by me, going up to see him, really to say goodbye. Studio. Lucian.
When did you decide to actually write it? You were having breakfast with him and becoming close friends with him. When did you decide to write a book? And did Lucian know that you were writing a book? And if so, did he try and censor parts of it?
He was dead by the time I started the book.
Oh, right.
And Brian Sewell, the Evening Standards critic, always thought, he's got this theory that older artists, writers, painters, often get pursued by younger men who they see as a way to extend their life, and it's either done consciously or self-consciously. And so he thinks Lucian completely knew what was going on. I think if I'd had the conversation with Lucian, by the way, Lucian, I'm going to do a book, I think it would have made him, I think it would have unsettled him. But David, who is the sort of guardian of him afterwards, loves the book, and there were a couple of very, very, very small changes, factual things, which he changed. The children have varying views on the book. But I think, Nancy Mitford wrote that, if you involve children in the decision about biography, you're never going to be able to write a biography. Because does anyone want to... I think a lot of people would find it uncomfortable or unusual to have your parents' sexual life put out, as well as their working life and their complications on paper. It is unsettling, and also, as I know full well, editing a newspaper, things in black and white are in just by themselves unsettling. I'm sure your subjects often think it was fine to say it, but golly, Lynn wrote it.
Yes.
Oh, there was a lady here. Yep.
I just wondered if the way that you looked at his art changed, having known him as a friend.
I think you become fonder of things which people do, which you're fond of. So maybe your critical faculty becomes more softened. But I must say I was blown out by the National Portrait Gallery show, and I think retrospectives are often times when, do you make it to the next generation or not, is a make or break time with these retrospectives. And I think Lucian, at that portrait retrospective, came through with impact, power, changing nature of portraits. It was brilliant show, I thought.
Would you rank him up with Bacon, though?
Well, Bacon was always le grand maître, to the petit maître of Lucian in his lifetime. You know, Francis had a show in Paris much earlier. He had a retrospective of the Tate much earlier. He was much more iconoclastic. There was a sort of drama and totemic nature of his art, which Lucian realised quite early on. If he went on doing his small domestic, like the ones of his early wives and lovers, he was going to be in danger of being a small painter. So if you see in the 70s and 80s and through to the 90s, there's a progression in, you know, going from very smooth, soft surfaces, very Germanic, to changing his paintbrush, to becoming wider, more open, changing the subject, bigger canvases, bigger subjects, more sort of Velasquez-like in saying what's the great drama. And that, I think, was chasing Bacon's influence. And I think it worked. I mean, some people will say, you know, early David Hockney is the only Hockney which will really last. And some people say the early Lucian, those amazing drawings and very still, steely precision, and those that Germanic sense, which he always denied he had any influence from Germany. But I think it is there. And actually, I think the influence from Spender, I whisper it in case someone's listening about it, is there. Yeah.
That would be the last question.
At what point did you decide that you were going to write a book, and did you record your thoughts after every breakfast? And if you didn't, how could you trust your memory?
I did record an awful lot. And did I think it was going to be a book? I'm a bit of a magpie with information and sort of things. You know, I've just moved back into my house and unloading boxes, and I'm, you know, finding. God, I found a letter from, you know, John Piper I'd written to in, you know, 1972, 73. So I'm always very conscious of information, and my memory's not very good. So I'm very conscious that if I really think something's important, you know, if I go to something incredible, I will sometimes write down it afterwards and just stuff it in a drawer. Do I keep a diary? Not in that sense. I wish I did. I'm sure you.
I do, yeah.
You know, I mean, but it's just.
But actually, yeah, because it's gone on so long and it's so detailed, I can't ever find anything.
But you see, what I would like to be is as brilliant as Lynn, whose memoir is out now, and it is, you know, it's a second memoir.
Yeah.
And it is. I bought it last week, and it is compelling, addictive, a lesson on how to pursue people, how to elucidate their lives, and give a clarity and sometimes the correct mixture of acidity and gentleness to tell a story, but also a lack of tolerance of bullshit and the sort of what gets in the way of finding a truth about talking to people today, which, you know, is your sort of mantra and what you're so fantastic. And I thought it would be so frightening, but actually it's been very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you both very much. I think we've all has come as close as we possibly could be to having tea with Lucian. But thanks to both Lynn and Geordie, and it was a lesson in the art of interviewing. I think they succeeded in interviewing each other as well as bringing Freud centre stage, and it took the form. I think they both said at some stage that a classical interview, a perfect interview, an interview which you feel is triumphant, is one where there's some revelation, something that you didn't know beforehand, however well you knew the subject. So I think we're all going to be going away thinking about DNA tests on various members of the... Okay, so thank you very much, Lynn and Geordie.
Thank you, Lynn.